The former president turned himself in and blasted the prosecutors in all 4 of the cases against him. We've been following the reaction and speaking with Georgia's Buddy Carter, a 5-term congressman. His view on Donald Trump and the allegations in Fulton County. Plus, how are changes in state law affecting local school districts and state colleges and universities as the new school year begins in Florida? Government law attorney Chris Hand looks at that, in addition to the record-setting weather conditions that bring attention to climate change on This Week in Jacksonville. Thanks for joining us. At the table today, U.S. Representative Buddy Carter from Georgia's 1st District. As we enjoy our conversation, Congressman, we're going to talk about a couple of bills that I know you're working on, your office says are important. We'll talk about those in a moment. First, tell me your reaction this week. Lots of activity after an indictment last week, and then the former President Trump turning himself in Georgia.
Yeah, it's, somewhat embarrassing, to be quite honest with you. I mean, here we have a former president yet again indicted by a judicial system that seems to be weighed against him. I mean, look, in the state of Georgia, Fulton County has long been a bastion for Democratic shenanigans, and we've understood that, and we've experienced that, and now we're experiencing it again. Look, everyone has a right to protest an election, and it happens all the time. It happened here in Florida when Al Gore and George Bush. You'll remember that. It happened again with Hillary Clinton in 2016. It happened again in 2018 in Georgia with Stacey Abrams. She claimed that there was malfeasance in the election system during that time. Yet there were no indictments then. And now we have these indictments, and there seems to be a 2-tiered judicial system here in America now. There seems to be one judicial system for if your name is Biden or Clinton, and another if you're anyone else, and that's really a shame. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of good people in the Department of Justice, a lot of good people in the FBI, but both of those agencies seem to have been politicized and against conservatives, and that's unfortunate, and we need to weed that out. We need to weed those bad apples out. There are bad apples in every organization, and they need to go. But it's really unfortunate that this has happened, but they will have their day in court. We are in America, and you are innocent until proven guilty. So they will have their day in court, but this seems to be more about revenge than it does about justice.
Is that because of the timing, or do you think that there really was nothing criminally that should be prosecuted?
I think it's going to be very difficult to prove that there was anything criminally that can be prosecuted. Again, we have freedom of speech, and we have the right to protest an election if we feel like there were wrongdoings in that election. It's been done before, but there weren't indictments then. I mean, it seems that against the former president, 91 counts total. There were only 13 counts against the Unabomber. I mean, this seems to be a system weighed against the former president, and it's really unfortunate, really sad in our country.
Well, let me ask this. I want to show a graphic here. It's a quote from Georgia's Governor Brian Kemp after the indictments just a week ago. He said, "The 2020 election in Georgia was not stolen. For nearly 3 years now, anyone with evidence of fraud has failed to come forward under oath and prove anything in a court of law. Our elections in Georgia are secure, accessible, and fair, and will continue to be as long as I'm governor." So do you agree with the governor's stance here? Was Joe Biden legitimately elected, at least as far as Georgia was concerned, in 2020?
I don't know whether there was fraud, whether there was anything unlawful during that election. And I have resolved that I will probably never know. But I do know that significant changes were made to the voting system in the state of Georgia with the Election Integrity Act by the Georgia State Legislature that resulted in significant and substantial changes to the voting system that I think made the voting easier and that made cheating harder. And I applaud them for doing that. That should have been done, and it was done. So whether there was anything that happened then, I do not know that. I have acknowledged that Joe Biden is president of the United States, and I have pledged to work with him. Unfortunately, this administration has not wanted to work in a bipartisan fashion, but we continue to try our best to work with this administration.
So final question on this topic, we'll move on, but you mentioned Stacey Abrams. So even the folks who said, hey, I'm not sure that I think this happened right, but nobody went that extra step of a phone call to the Secretary of State and said, find me the votes to win. Aren't those different things?
Well, they're different, but then again, they're the same thing. Both of them were protesting the election, and both of them were were questioning the results of the election. But what's the difference? One of them turned it into an indictment and another one didn't. But everyone has the right to question that. We have freedom of speech here in America. So this will play out in the courts, and we'll see what will happen. And I'm one who believes that justice will prevail.
Let's talk a little bit, Congressman, about some legislation. Specifically, I saw the Passport Modernization Act. So what does this bipartisan bill do? Why is this needed even?
Listen, we, and I suspect all congressional offices throughout the country, have been inundated with requests for passports as we are post-pandemic now, people wanting to travel and get out, and they are realizing now that in many cases their passports have expired or they can't find their passport. Our office has just been inundated with the request, and this is a bipartisan bill, as you mentioned, that will give the Department of State more latitude in hiring more people and to deal with the passports and to see how they can modernize their systems.
Are you reading my mail? Because yes, I reached out to my congressman this summer to say, hey, I'm having a hard time getting the passport. I know a lot of folks who have kind of walked through this. One of the other bills I saw you talking about concerns protecting right whales and safety regulations. What is this about? Well,
NOAA has proposed a rule that would limit the speed of recreational recreational boats, as well as any boat between 35 and 65 feet. And during the right whale mating season, which is 7 months out of the year on the Atlantic coast, it would limit it to 11.5 miles per hour. Look, we all care about the right whales. We all want to protect them. We don't want to see them go extinct. We live on the coast because we love the coast and we love the environment, and all of us agree with that. However, this is short-sighted, and this would potentially crush recreational fishing and have a negative impact on our ports. And the Georgia ports are the economic engine of the Southeast United States. We cannot afford to do that. Not only that, but it would endanger these boats. It would endanger them and put them in a situation where they may actually capsize if they don't have the ability to go more than 11.5 miles an hour. How are you going to enforce it?
So if somebody's watching and they're not a boater, how does that play out? Lowering the speed is dangerous. I think a lot of people would not necessarily understand that.
Yeah, well, lowering the speed is dangerous because, you know, when you're talking about a mariner being on the water, there are going to be times when you have to speed up. And if you're limited to 11.5 miles an hour, that's going to slow the bar pilots and the harbors, which will slow what they're doing and trying to get the cargo through. That's going to have a negative impact.
You don't have the power
Absolutely, and not only that, but they've also shown that it would, you know, there's less than a 1 in a million chance that one of these boats will hit a right whale. And there's other technology available. That's what we need to keep in mind. There's technology out there available, sensors on buoys, AI, which is a big subject now here in Washington, D.C., artificial intelligence. I was in Canada a couple of months ago and met with Meta Canada, the Facebook portion of Canada up there, and they were telling us that they have the ability and the technology now where they can identify those whales without having to tag them. They can identify and tell where they're at. Well, you know, look, I was a small businessman for 32 years.
Use some of that instead of potentially hurting
Again,
business.
as a small businessman, you know, you had to be smart. You got to be smarter than them, and there's other ways we can do this without crushing the recreational and then the harbor pilots.
U.S. Representative Buddy Carter from Georgia's 1st District. I like how you put that. Thanks for the time today.
Thank you.
All right. And stay with us. We'll be joined by former Jacksonville Chief of Staff Chris Hand. The government law attorney is with us next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And with us now, government law attorney Chris Hand. We call this monthly segment Hand on Government. And Chris, we've watched this situation play out throughout the course of the summer now. 91 total charges against the former president. The most recent thing was he was arrested this past Thursday, turning himself in Fulton County, Georgia. This is a legal issue, but certainly he and his defenders want to make it a political issue as well.
Well, we're seeing something that we have not seen very often in American history, which is a former president who now has 4 indictments against him. one from the state of New York on the charge of falsifying business records, 2 from the federal government, 1 related to the kind of holding on of classified documentation, not returning it to the federal government, 1, of course, related to the events of January 6th and the insurrection that happened at the U.S. Capitol during the certifying of Electoral College votes, and, of course, now 1 from the state of Georgia related to actions that occurred after the election, alleged attempts to interfere with election officials. President Trump's now famous or infamous call to the Georgia Secretary of State related to election results, ginning up a sort of separate electoral vote process in the state of Georgia, and a variety of other charges, including some that didn't happen in the state of Georgia. Georgia has a very broad racketeering statute, and so a lot of these charges are what's called RICO, which brings together a variety of different crimes under a single heading. Georgia has a very, like I said, has a very broad racketeering law, and so now we've seen a number of charges levied in a state, just one state to the north of Florida.
So this is definitely not the pile on the former president show. We want to give some perspective. We'll show some video here of President Trump after being arrested and turning himself in just on Thursday. This is the mugshot that came out. This is certainly something people are talking about, Chris. But we've never seen Secret Service inside a jail facility like we're seeing here. And I do want to play some of his comments. Former President Trump did speak after and just before he was leaving Atlanta to go back to New Jersey. But here's what he said about the most recent charges.
What they're doing is election interference. They're trying to interfere with an election. There's never been anything like it in our country before. This is their way of campaigning. And this is one instance, but you have 3 other instances. It's election interference.
And Chris, I just spoke with Congressman Buddy Carter from Georgia, and of course he is a defender of the president, and he says he doesn't know exactly the truth of what happened in 2020 in Georgia. But is there something to this, the arguments that, hey, the Department of Justice or local prosecutors in this case have been weaponized for a political purpose?
Well, of course, all of this is going to be determined in a court of law. Now, with these 4 indictments, and the president, like former president, like any criminal defendant, is entitled to a presumption of innocence until a court and a jury and judges kind of ultimately rule on these questions. I think the main challenge for former President Trump is the nature of some of these charges. For example, the documents charges, the idea that he took classified federal documents, kept them at Mar-a-Lago, didn't return them to the federal government, and in some cases maybe even obstructed the effort to return those documents. That's a fairly straightforward charge that I suspect prosecutors feel they have ample evidence to be able to charge. Some of the evidence in the Georgia case is very public at this point. For example, his now very well-known telephone call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger on January 2nd, 2021, where former President Trump speak to the need to find
the 11,000 plus votes.
Exactly, so that I can win this election, and also suggesting in that call that the Secretary of State might face criminal charges if he didn't do that. So a lot of this evidence is now public and fairly straightforward. Of course, we'll have to see what the criminal justice process ultimately yields in terms of judges and juries. But from a legal standpoint, the fact that there are now 4 indictments certainly put the former president in some legal jeopardy. What that means for the political season might be an entirely different question.
So we will shift completely political here. The former president was not in attendance in Milwaukee, Wisconsin Wednesday night. First GOP presidential candidates debate. What did you see there? I mean, it was 2 hours and lots of conversation, lots of jockeying for position among those 8 candidates who were there.
Well, I think one of the things that debate showed is that the person who wasn't present remains the dominant force in today's Republican Party. Going into that debate, depending on which polls, state and national polls you look at, President Trump has leads of 20, 30, 40, 50 points over the rest of the Republican field at this point. And it doesn't feel like the dynamics of that debate did much to change that ultimate result. In fact, you had a situation where 7 of the 9 candidates who were on that debate stage, when asked if they would support President Trump as the nominee, even if he were convicted of crimes, said they would. So again, I think the debate sort of reinforced the extent to which he is the dominant force in the party right now. Everyone else at this point is sort of maneuvering for second or third place behind where he stands right now. Now, again, we've got a lot of time left until the first Republican primary contest. Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, places like that will start voting in January and February, so there's a lot of time there. But it doesn't feel like this debate significantly changed the dynamics of former President Trump leading the field by a big margin and everybody else at this point maneuvering for second or third place.
We've got a graphic of all the candidates who participated in the debate, and I want you to look at this. And center stage was Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor. Here's the thing I want to bring up. The post-debate coverage, I listened to Fox News for some of that, and I listened to MSNBC for some of that, and they both said, they all talked about Ron DeSantis. But one perspective was he had the worst night of anybody, and the other network said he had the best night of anybody. Is there any truth to any of this? Because the voters really want to, starting today until they get to primary in March, try and figure out who they want to support, right?
Well, it's very hard to draw a direct line between a debate that happens in August of the year before the primary contest and the ultimate results in the primary contest. I would say there were non-surprising and surprising aspects of Governor DeSantis' debate performance. Not surprising was his messaging. He was pretty consistent with what he said here in Florida on the stump, very consistent in what he said during the debate. I think a little more surprising was there was some speculation before the debate that his competitors would focus on him, try and draw contrast with him, maybe criticize aspects of his record. That didn't really happen, which sort of suggests that some of the other competitors at the moment do not see him as the biggest impediment to their own ambitions. Now, we'll see if that dynamic changes at all in the next debate, which I believe is going to be in California in the month of September, and whether there are any changes in that strategy. But I think to me, one of the surprises was that while the governor was front and center in terms of his positioning, he wasn't necessarily front and center in terms of the amount of times he spoke during the debate or his overall presence there. He stuck to his messaging, but the other candidates really didn't focus on him. They focused on others.
Yeah. Well, Chris, stay with us, and you stay with us too. What are local leaders doing to address the new laws in education? We're going to dive in with Chris when we come back. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Chris Hand with us. Hand on Government is our segment. Let's continue the conversation by going a little bit more regional and local. This weekend, temperatures in the high 90s again. What we've seen earlier in this month and throughout the summer, extreme temperatures, Chris. So the question is, what are government leaders around the state doing or not doing when it comes to the impacts of some climate change?
Well, at the moment, we're seeing a lot of activity at the local level, Kent, because the Florida legislature is not in session. It'll be back in session in January of 2024. But we are seeing some local governments take action. For example, Miami-Dade County has a chief heat officer who's focused on trying to combat the effects of extreme heat and coordinate efforts throughout that county. Here in the city of Jacksonville, during this very difficult heat wave, July was the hottest month on record. August did not show much improvement in that regard. So the city of Jacksonville has set up cooling centers and taken some other steps to try and give residents relief from the heat. And some other Florida cities have taken steps like that as well. It'll be interesting to see, does the Florida legislature take action to deal with this, whether that's in terms of resiliency or other efforts to combat the effects of climate change. We do know that one Florida legislator from here in the Jacksonville area is taking action. State Representative Angie Nixon has announced that she's going to file a bill that would require landlords to provide air conditioning in addition to heat. Right now in Florida, if you're a landlord, you're required to provide your tenants with heat, but you're not legally required to do that with air conditioning. So she's going to look for a change in the law that would also require air conditioning in that respect.
So eventually it would be literally criminal not to have AC living in Florida. I mean, that's the joke that, wow, how can you live without that? But another topic I know we wanted to talk about, there have been changing laws concerning education. So what's your view? Students are back in school, or if they're in college, maybe they've just started or getting ready to go back. There are some things that instructors and students have to know about. about here?
Well, I think it's important to understand, and particularly, look, we, in the last several weeks at the 67 school districts around the state, students and teachers coming back to school, and coming back to school with a lot of uncertainty in some different areas. So, for example, we talked during our last Hand on Government segment about some of the controversy around Black history standards, and that controversy has continued. For example, the state education commissioner was supposed to speak in South Florida about those changes, ended up canceling that appearance, so that was a source of some controversy. But there's also been a lot of other sort of confusion as schools come back in. For example, there was controversy over whether or not high schools could teach AP psychology, and some debate between the College Board and the State Board of Education over whether that would happen. So you've got
with the education commissioner kind of reversing course eventually. Oh, you can teach this.
That's right. The uncertainty has still been there. So you've got 67 districts, and not all of them necessarily are teaching it right now. Add all of that sort of instability, Kent, to what is a major teacher shortage here in the state of Florida. At the time schools started, there were somewhere in the neighborhood, and these numbers have changed a little bit depending on the source, but somewhere around 8,000 teacher shortages in the state of Florida, and about 6,000 support staff shortages. So you can imagine the pressure that puts on administrators, teachers, and students as we start this new school year. So a lot of issues percolating out there in public education as we start the new school year. Of course, as we move throughout the first 9 weeks in this first semester, we'll have to track to see if those continue to have a lingering effect.
What the impact of all of that is. And at the
That's
same
right.
time, by the way, and we mentioned, and you probably know, but Duval County Public Schools actively looking for the next superintendent of schools. So those kind of changes we'll be watching as well. Chris, I appreciate it. And I know we get to talk about a lot of different things. I look forward to it every month. We get to find out, hey, what are the topics, state, local, federal, that we can talk about. Thanks for the time.
Look forward to our September conversation, Kent.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so you'll want to tune in next Sunday morning at 9 for This Week in Jackson. We're talking about the city's budget deadline that's approaching. The chair of the City Council Finance Committee is going to join us and talk about the changes that council may make to the mayor's proposal. Plus, launching a new effort aimed at building unity across the entire region. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17. And then you'll find us online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus.
See why every day more people are choosing News 4 Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.